They humiliated her, thinking they were breaking her, but in truth, brick by brick, they were building her triumph. She worked as a waitress in a run-down diner on the outskirts of the city, a place people came not so much to eat as to wait out the rain or drown their fatigue in cheap coffee. The ceiling was low and suffocating, the air heavy with the persistent smell of frying oil that didn't dissipate even with the windows open. At the tables sat those who had long forgotten what dreams felt like. Red-eyed truckers, slightly drunk students, local elders arguing about politics and sighing over their youth. She had learned to move between tables quickly and unnoticed, like a shadow. Yet her clumsiness betrayed her in the smallest ways. Spilled tea, a stray crumb on the floor, a tray clattering against the edge of a table. That was enough to draw laughter. Short, hollow, contemptuous. She was used to it.
She had even learned to drop her gaze at the exact moment someone hurled a sarcastic, "Well, aren't you a master?" or "Better eat yourself than serve us." The manager, a man in his 40s with perpetually greasy hair, liked to remind her of the place she occupied. He stood by the cash register as if it were a throne, repeating with a smile, "You'll never get out of this hole. This is where your life ends." She stayed silent. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. The words lodged inside her like stones, stacked deep within. Outwardly, she appeared quiet, tired, even helpless. People ignored her, like furniture that had stood in the same spot for years. But beneath that silence lay a tension no one sensed. She knew that silence could be a weakness, but it could also be a weapon. The only question was how long you could hold it. Every night, she sat at her old laptop, humming like a worn-out refrigerator. The keys had long since lost their letters, and the screen flickered with a bluish glow, as if unsure whether it could survive another night. In the room, barely large enough for a bed and a desk, there was silence. Silence. The only luxury she could afford. No one knew that behind these walls, another world was being written. Here, she was not a quiet waitress. She was a voice, deciding how her characters' fates would unfold. Her heroes possessed what she lacked: the strength to rise after a fall, the courage to say no, the right to go where others forbade. She wrote in fragments, a page before bed, a dialogue on a scrap of napkin, quickly tucked into her pocket between orders. Sometimes she caught herself eavesdropping on customers' conversations. Intonations, phrases, even gestures. She carried it all away like a thief, ready to transform it later into living characters. Every humiliation she endured during the day became fuel by night. If someone laughed at her clumsiness, it became a scene where a hero fell into a trap but found a way out. If the manager humiliated her, she painted the image of a tyrant, ultimately undone by his own pride. Her pain did not vanish. It transformed into material. Over the years, her computer accumulated hundreds of documents. Incomplete chapters, dialogues without context, fragments of cities and battles. She pieced together a puzzle without knowing when it would be complete. But she knew one thing for certain. This chaos had purpose. Every day of humiliation and silence was only part of a greater work. Her reality was gray, but her texts glowed like embers. She felt truly alive only when she wrote. One evening, as her shift was ending, the manager announced a contest. Each employee had to pitch an idea for a new cafe advertisement. The winner would receive a small bonus and praise from management. She hesitated for a long time, but for the first time allowed herself to step forward. On a scrap of paper, she wrote a concept, simple yet alive. A short story about a casual visitor who comes for just a minute but ends up staying forever, having found in this place something warmer than coffee. She left her note among the others and returned to work. The next day, the manager ceremoniously read aloud the innovative idea. Word for word, her text, signed with a colleague's name. Everyone clapped, and the colleague, smiling awkwardly, accepted the praise. No one even suspected who the words truly belonged to. She watched silently. Her fingers clenched the crumpled napkin in her pocket, another fragment of her still unwritten world. Not a muscle twitched on her face. To everyone else, it was clear. The quiet girl had lost again, stayed silent again, let herself be used again. But that same evening, she wrote a chapter. The hero in it had also been betrayed by a friend, the one he had trusted most. And this hero fell, but did not break. He rose again, breathing hard, blood on his lips, and it was precisely that fall that made him stronger. When she placed the final period, something new appeared in her eyes. She realized that allowing the world to trample over her was not defeat. It was an investment. Every insult, every theft, every injustice only added to her material. She accepted the pain not as an accident, but as part of the plan. From that moment on, she knew. She could remain silent for as long as needed. She could let others believe they were winning. In reality, they were only building the foundation for her manuscript. Years passed. She no longer worked as a waitress, no longer carried trays, no longer swallowed the mockery of others. Now her name appeared on the cover of a book that had unexpectedly climbed the charts. Readers wrote to her, confessing that, for the first time, they had felt someone could capture their pain, their own humiliations and falls, with such precision. At book events, journalists swarmed around her with recorders. How did you manage to describe the feeling of helplessness so realistically? Why does betrayal in your stories feel as if you've lived it to the bone yourself? Is this autobiographical? She simply smiled. She never gave direct answers. Only now did the full picture emerge. Everything that had once seemed like random suffering had been a resource. Every humiliating remark from the manager, every harsh laugh from a customer, every stolen word, she had preserved it all. Not as a victim, but as a strategist. Her silence, which everyone had perceived as weakness, was her method. She let them humiliate her because she knew. Their insults would transform into material, into bricks with which she would build her own story. Now it was no longer a hidden process, but an undeniable fact. Those who thought they were destroying her were in reality working for her. When her face appeared on magazine covers, the world saw a miracle from nothing. The story of the girl from a rundown diner who had risen to the top looked inspiring. That's how the publishers sold it. But the truth was different. She hadn't risen from nothing. She had risen from their filth, stamped with the marks they themselves had left behind. At a book signing in the city center, she noticed familiar faces. Those who once hurled jokes at her now held her book in their hands. They waited in line, nervously adjusting their hair, trying to pass forced smiles as sincerity. The former manager, sweat gleaming on his forehead, carried 3 copies under his arm. For my wife, for a colleague, and one more. For myself. He repeated the same words he had once said, but now in the tone of a supplicant. I always believed in you. She signed the book neatly, without lifting her eyes. Only a brief nod. Her silence was once again a weapon, but now no longer hidden. The irony of the moment was unbearable for them, and sweet for her. They were standing in line for a piece of what they themselves had given her. Their cruelty, their mockery, their thefts, all of it had been converted into lines they now bought with money and begged her to sign. They saw a miracle, but they did not see the mechanism. Her power had always been near, in the shadows. She just knew how to wait and collect. And now those who once trampled her stood below,
lifting their heads toward the stage where she sat.